Welcome to Bedtime Haunting, the podcast where the past isn't silent and forgotten places speak again. Each week, we uncover the real histories behind the world's most mysterious places. Stories of silence, memory, and endurance. I'd love to hear from you. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Share your ideas for future episodes in the comments, or leave a rating wherever you listen. This is Season 1, The Asylums of History. A dry wind moves through the limestone corridors, carrying salt and dust from the Indian Ocean. The walls of the old Fremantle lunatic asylum breathe in that air as they always have, porous as bone, the color of bleached sand. In the glare of afternoon light, the place looks almost radiant. 2-story wings, arched windows, pale stone glowing against a cobalt sky. But step inside, and the brightness fades quickly. The heat lingers, the air turns heavy, and the wind becomes a whisper that seems to circle back on itself. These walls remember. In the early 1850s, Western Australia was still a remote colonial outpost. The nearest city lay a month's sea voyage away, and the settlement at Fremantle clung to the coast like a pocket of stubborn life. Ships arrived with convicts, supplies, and letters months old. Among the convicts were stonemasons and laborers who would soon build the colony's hospitals, prisons, and churches, and inevitably, its asylum. The Fremantle Lunatic Asylum began not as a place of mercy, but as a necessity. The colony had no institution for those deemed insane. The few who could not be managed at home were kept in the town jail or in wooden sheds behind a police station. When Governor Charles Fitzgerald ordered the creation of an asylum, it was seen as an act of reform, a symbol that the young colony could care for its vulnerable as well as its criminals. Construction started in 1857 under the supervision of Henry W. Reveley, the colonial engineer, using limestone quarried from nearby cliffs and laid by convict hands. The first building rose quickly, 2 wings, a central hall, and high windows to admit light while preserving modesty. It was meant to house just 50 inmates, though even that number was optimistic for a population barely scraping survival from the land. The convicts who built the asylum left their signatures in the walls, initials carved into corner stones, a handprint pressed into drying mortar. When the building opened in 1865, the very men who had built it sometimes became its first residents. Convict labor and colonial despair were never far apart. Inside, conditions were harsh, but not unusual for the time. There was no running water. Ventilation came through slatted shutters, and summer temperatures turned the rooms into ovens. The patients, men and women, separated by a single thick wall, slept on straw mattresses and rose at dawn to the sound of the turnkey's keys. Food was basic: bread, salted meat, tea. A visiting doctor reported that the heat and lack of shade caused derangement of spirits among both inmates and attendants. He might have been describing the entire colony. Treatment was primitive, guided by British asylum models decades old. Cold baths, confinement, and routine were considered curative. The superintendent, Dr. Barnett, wrote that labor, cleanliness, and quiet reflection were the three pillars of recovery. But there was little work available, and reflection easily became despair. Some patients were sailors, driven mad by fever or head injury. Others, settlers, broken by isolation. A few were indigenous men and women whose trauma had no name in the colonial vocabulary. To administrators, they were simply disturbed or dangerous. Outside, the town of Fremantle expanded around the asylum. Markets grew, pubs multiplied, and the port began to prosper. Yet, within those limestone walls, time thickened. The sound of the sea was constant, sometimes a comfort, sometimes a torment. Visitors described the building as both beautiful and terrible. It gleams in the sun like a cathedral, one traveler wrote in 1872, yet its purpose chills the heart. By then, the asylum was already overcrowded, housing nearly twice its intended number. The colony's growth meant more settlers, more accidents, more despair. The building groaned under the weight of human need. In 1876, a report to the colonial government declared the Fremantle Asylum unsuitable for the humane care of the insane due to heat, lack of ventilation, and poor drainage. Plans were made for a new facility inland at Claremont, but government funds were scarce. So the asylum endured, patched and repainted, its limestone whitening further with every summer. The wind kept moving through it, carrying the salt smell of the harbor and the faint echo of distant waves. An endless reminder that this place was built between two immensities, the ocean outside and the mind within. By the 1880s, the Fremantle Asylum had become a world unto itself. The town outside had a telegraph office, a courthouse, and a growing sense of modern ambition. But inside the limestone walls, little had changed. Corridors baked in the sun, iron bars shimmered with heat, and the smell of lime and sweat hung over everything. The population, meant to be 50, had passed 100. Patients slept in storerooms or beneath stairwells. Attendants carried water in buckets from the well behind the kitchen. When storms rolled in from the Indian Ocean, the roof leaked, and water pooled in the ward corners like small, stubborn lakes. Life here was defined by routine. Bells marked the hours, rising, meals, inspections, lights out. Men were put to work in the gardens, hacking at dry earth to coax up vegetables that rarely grew. Women scrubbed linens in the courtyard, their hands cracked with lye. The rhythm of labor was meant to heal, but in the endless heat, it often exhausted more than it restored. Some attendants tried small kindnesses, a longer rest in the shade, an extra cup of tea. But the system valued order above mercy. Medical treatment remained a mixture of discipline and guesswork. Doctors recorded melancholia, mania, and imbecility in ledgers written in a tight colonial hand. Opium tinctures were used to calm agitation, cold baths to restore balance. On especially hot days, nurses laid wet cloths across patients' foreheads and whispered prayers under their breath. A few believed that music could soothe the mind, and the faint sound of a harmonium sometimes drifted through the wards. It was borrowed from the church across the street, a fragile attempt to bring harmony into a place built on confinement. The heat defined everything. By noon, walls radiated warmth like a kiln. Birds shrieked in the courtyard, seeking shade under the eaves. The air shimmered above the limestone like a mirage, A nurse wrote in her notes, "It feels as though the world outside has been erased, and only this light remains, too bright to see through. In that glare, even time seemed to falter." Despite the hardships, Fremantle's people came to view the asylum with a kind of uneasy pride. It was the colony's first purpose-built institution, proof that Western Australia could care for its own. Newspapers printed cautious praise. "The care of the afflicted reflects credit upon our settlement," one article declared in 1884, though it omitted any mention of the smell, the crowding, or the cries heard at night when the wind turned offshore. Among the patients were settlers broken by isolation, sailors delirious from tropical fevers, and Aboriginal men and women confined for reasons that had little to do with medicine. The colonial government treated their imprisonment as protective custody, a phrase that revealed more about power than compassion. A few missionaries visited to read scripture. Most left quickly, shaken by what they saw. There were no formal records of escape attempts, though a story survived of a man who climbed the outer wall one night and vanished into the scrub, never to be found. By the 1890s, Fremantle itself was changing. Gold had been discovered far inland, and the port was bustling with ships, prospectors, and traders. The asylum stood only a short walk from a harbor, yet it might as well have been another century. Funds for improvement were promised, then diverted elsewhere. When inspectors arrived from Perth, attendants hurriedly patched cracks and whitewashed the courtyard walls. Reports continued to describe the building as outdated but serviceable. Still, moments of grace appeared amid the monotony. On Christmas mornings, volunteers brought oranges and small gifts from town. A choir sang carols in the courtyard, the sound rising against the white walls and out toward the sea. For an hour or two, the place resembled a chapel rather than a hospital. Then the visitors left, and silence returned, except for the wind scraping gently across the shutters like fingertips on stone. The turn of the century finally brought change. The new Claremont Hospital for the Insane opened outside Perth in 1903, and many patients were transferred there. Fremantle's old asylum was left, with fewer than 40 residents, most elderly or too frail to move. For a time it served as a home for destitute women, then as temporary lodgings for immigrants waiting for work. Each new purpose layered over the last, but the building never lost its original presence. People in town said that, even empty, it seemed occupied. For a few decades, the old asylum drifted between uses, as if the building itself could not quite find rest. In the 1920s, it became the Fremantle Hospital. Its wards reopened to treat soldiers and sailors returning from the First World War. Nurses remarked on the strangeness of tending new wounds inside rooms that still carried older ghosts. The structure was sturdy, but its age showed. Plaster flaked, floors bowed under footfall, and the scent of salt never left the walls. By the 1930s, the city of Fremantle had grown up around it. Streets that were once dusty tracks now echoed with trams and the clang of shipyards. The asylum's thick limestone, once isolation, now stood amid noise. Yet inside those walls, the atmosphere remained strangely still. When the Depression struck, the building was converted again, this time into a women's home and later a training center for midwives. The old wards became classrooms, the exercise yard a place for laundry lines and prams. Young nurses, barely out of school, walked through the same corridors that had once confined the unwell. Some spoke of feeling watched, of hearing footsteps after lights out, though they rarely admitted it aloud. The building's long history of reuse left its mark on the town's collective memory. People called it the old asylum, no matter what name the government gave it. Children dared each other to touch its gates. Sailors asked for directions to it as a landmark. To many, it embodied the idea that Fremantle itself had grown from punishment to care, from convict labor to community service. But not everyone agreed. Local elders of the Whadjuk Noongar people, whose ancestors had been confined there under colonial laws, remembered it differently. For them, the site carried sorrow as much as pride, a reminder that the machinery of empire had reached even here, to the farthest edge of the continent. After the Second World War, the building's identity shifted yet again. It became part of the Fremantle Technical School, housing art and design classes. Students painted in the rooms once called cells. Canvases replaced iron bedsteads. The limestone walls, porous and soft, absorbed new colors, new voices. By the 1960s, when heritage awareness was rising in Australia, local artists began arguing that the asylum should be preserved, not demolished. They saw in its arches and courtyards a rare piece of colonial craftsmanship, and in its long, difficult past, a story worth telling. The campaign succeeded. In 1970, after more than a century of service, neglect, and adaptation, the Fremantle Lunatic Asylum was reborn as the Fremantle Arts Centre. Restoration work revealed layers of paint, graffiti from convicts, and the faint outlines of old window bars. Workers reported strange sensations, cold patches in the heat, murmurs in empty corridors. Whether ghostly or simply the product of memory, no one could say. When the Arts Center officially opened in 1973, the first exhibition was titled Foundations, a quiet acknowledgement of the building's buried past. In the decades that followed, the site became a hub for music, writing, and visual art. The same rooms that once held silence now filled with voices and instruments. Concerts echoed through the courtyard on summer nights. Poets read under the fig trees. Some visitors spoke of feeling an undercurrent, as if the walls still remembered their original purpose. A local musician described performing there as singing to the building itself. Perhaps that was fitting. For more than 100 years, the asylum had contained what society couldn't face. Now, it held what people wanted to express. The Fremantle Arts Centre remains one of the most visited cultural venues in Western Australia. Its limestone still gleams in the sun, though the marks of time are visible. The slight tilt of the floors, the uneven chill of certain corners. Heritage plaques describe the history with careful neutrality, but guides sometimes add their own quieter notes. The nurse who stayed after her shift to sit with a dying patient. The gardener who spoke gently to the flowers as if to calm the air. The unnamed women who once pressed their hands against these walls and left traces of oil in the stone. Each story adds a thread binding the building's past and present together. What makes Fremantle remarkable is not that it survived, but that it evolved. Few institutions born of confinement managed to become spaces of creation. The transformation did not erase what came before. It absorbed it. The sound of laughter in the courtyard, the rhythm of guitars during festivals, even the chatter of school groups, all carry a faint echo of earlier voices. In the shimmer of heat above the limestone, history feels both distant and close, like a mirage that refuses to fade. Today, when you walk through the Fremantle Arts Center, the first thing you notice is the light. It falls differently here, broken, refracted by high windows and thick stone. The air smells faintly of salt and old mortar. Visitors wander from gallery to gallery, unaware that they are tracing the same paths that once led to isolation rooms and wards. In one corner, a set of wooden stairs creaks with each step, the sound rising and fading, like a voice half remembered. Outside, the sea wind moves through the fig trees and over the courtyard, stirring dust across the flagstones. Guides often say the building is haunted. Some claim to have seen figures in the upper windows at dusk, or to have heard the echo of footsteps in empty corridors. The stories persist, perhaps because they feel plausible. A place that has witnessed so much sorrow cannot simply forget. But the real haunting of Fremantle lies not in apparitions. It lives in memory, in a way history seeps quietly into the present, shaping how a community sees itself. Every stone of the old asylum tells two stories, one of empire and control, the other of endurance. The convicts who carved those blocks could not have imagined that the building would one day hold music festivals and art exhibitions. The doctors who signed admission papers could not have foreseen that their wards would be filled with school groups and tourists. Yet somehow the transformation feels complete, as though the building has exhaled after a century of holding its breath. It's easy to forget that for much of its life, this place was a frontier, not just of geography, but of understanding. In the 19th century, mental illness was an enigma wrapped in fear. Colonies like Western Australia inherited Britain's systems, but lacked its resources. Isolation was both treatment and punishment. What began as a gesture of compassion became a mirror of society's limitations. The Fremantle Asylum reminds us that progress is rarely linear. It moves in loops, revisiting the same questions in brighter light. Somewhere in the archives, among the faded ledgers and typed reports, a nurse's note survives. He is calmer now. The sea breeze helped. It is a simple sentence, but it captures something essential, a faith in small mercies. Even in the harshest institutions, humanity flickered through. A cool drink of water, a hand held through a restless night, a song hummed softly when no one else was listening. Those moments did not make the place humane, but they made it human. In the end, Fremantle's story is one of continuity rather than erasure. The limestone still stands. The wind still carries the salt of the Indian Ocean through its corridors. Only the purpose has changed. Where once the walls contained suffering, they now hold expression. Where silence reigned, there is sound of guitars, footsteps, and laughter. It is not redemption exactly, but something quieter, acknowledgement. Perhaps that is why people linger when they visit. They walk slowly through the rooms, run their hands along the rough stone, and feel the temperature shift between light and shadow. The building doesn't demand belief in ghosts. It asks only for attention. To stand here is to feel how time folds, how the lives of strangers continue to breathe through the spaces they once occupied. The Fremantle Lunatic Asylum was built by convicts, filled by colonists, emptied by reformers, and revived by artists. Each generation found its reflection in the walls. What remains is a reminder that progress is fragile, that compassion must be rebuilt as carefully as any stone arch. The asylum story belongs not just to Western Australia, but to every place where care and confinement have shared a boundary. As the sun lowers over Fremantle and the wind turns cool, the building seems to settle into itself. The sea is a thin line of silver beyond the rooftops. Somewhere a musician is tuning a guitar for the evening's performance. The notes drift across the courtyard, mingling with the rustle of leaves. For a moment, the air feels balanced between silence and song, between past and present, between what was and what endures. Subscribe to Bedtime Haunting on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube for new episodes every week.